So let's start by creating a really basic line plot. Okay, so let's imagine we've got some data to plot. So here's my X data and here's my Y data, and here I've just made up two lists of numbers. But obviously, in reality, you'd be probably plotting some outputs from your model or whatever it may be. But I've just got two lists of numbers basically. And the first thing I'm going to do is import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. Then I've set up my data here, but obviously, as I say, that I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes. So what I need to do is I need to create a figure object and an axes object, and add the axes object as a subplot of the figure object. And if that sounds complex, don't worry, because basically it's this line of code. So what we're doing here is we're creating a figure object. I've called it figure 1. I can call it anything I like. An axes object, again, because I've just got one convention that says you tend to name that AX, but you can call it whatever you like. Equals, so into those, these will store our objects. And so we use this silent operator, and we call subplots from matplotlib.pyplot, which we're just calling PLT now. So the figure name, comma, AX equals PLT.subplots will essentially create a figure, a figure object containing this axes object, which will store your graph. Then we can basically start creating our graph. So I can set an x-axis label and a y-axis label. So let's imagine x represents time, and the y-axis represents number of patients. So I can just call on my axes object, which remember I've called AX, which represents this particular graph. I can just say AX dot set X label and pass in the name that I want for that. Set Y label and pass in the name for the Y-axis. And then I just say AX dot plot and tell it the data I want to plot. And that will create a line plot. So if I'm going to plot X against Y, so this is my data here, and then that generates the graph. So, I mean, if you didn't want it without labels, you can ignore that middle bit, although generally you want labels. And then I can show the figure. So I can just say, I can call the show method on the figure object. Okay, so you're creating, on the axes object, you're kind of creating the details of the graph. And then I'm going to choose to show the figure object, which contains the axes object, which is the graph. So I just say figure1.show. And that will display this. And if you don't believe me, let me switch out. I've got this already lined up here. So that's exactly the same code. Let me run that for you. This isn't getting in the way, so let's move that there. Just give it a second, and there we go. That's a graph. Literally that easy. I mean, this was just put into to create some data, but you've probably already got the data. So basically, this and this where I plot it, and this where I show it, are the three lines of code to generate that graph. Here I've just added in some axis labels. However, I probably want to do a bit more than a very basic graph like that. And we can do all sorts of extra little things too. So we can really easily, if we wanted to, change the style of the line that we're plotting. And we can do that just by adding various arguments, inputs, to the plot method. So when we call plot, before we just said plot X against Y, but we can add in extra information there. We could say, okay, give me a plot which is X against Y, but I want the color, note the American spelling you'll need to use, equals red, and there's various preset colors that you can use, or you can specify if you really want detail, and I'll show you the links to the information where you can get these different colors. You can specify them using sort of RGB values. You probably don't need to go that detailed. I've specified the line style equals, and then hyphen gives you this kind of dashed line basically there. And again, there's lots of different line styles that you can use. So I've very easily converted that into a dashed line there. Now, that sort of thing where you're changing the style of a line comes into its own really where you're plotting more than one plot within your graph, more than one line in your line graph, for example. And it's really easy if you want to plot more than one line in your graph. You simply call the plot method again. So here I've got some data. I've got time here, which will be on my x-axis as I had before. But then I've got a list representing the number of patients and a list representing the number of doctors within a clinic at any time. I've set up everything exactly as I had before, but this time I've got two calls on the plot method. In the first one, I'm going to plot time against patients. I want that to be coloured blue and just a solid line style. If you don't put anything for line style, it'll default to solid. But if you're using multiple plots, it's sometimes good practice to explicitly specify that, because it makes it also easier to change that as well if you wanted to change that. And I'm also then going to call a second plot on plotting time against doctors, and I want that one to be coloured red. And I'm going to use this dotted line, which you use a colon to notate that. And you can see then by doing that, I've now got a graph with two lines on it. One with a blue line, which indicates patients, and one with a red dotted line that represents doctors. But of course, if you're going to do that, you probably want to put in some sort of legend so that people know which line represents which. And the good news is it's really easy to add a legend as well. We just basically specify that we want one, and also make sure that we add a label to each of the lines that we're plotting. So this is exactly the same as it was before, except this time, when I call the plot methods for each of the lines, as well as the colour and the line style, and the data, obviously, that I'm plotting, I'm also going to add an argument here that says label equals, and then a string, and that will represent whatever that line represents, and that will be used as the text in our legend. And again, I do that for the second plot for doctors. And then by setting that up, all I've got to do to add the legend is call ax.legend. So I call the legend method of the axes object. You have to do that after you've done the plots, so that it knows what it's creating a legend of. And this is optional, but you can pass in, I can't remember what the default is, it might be upper right, I can't remember, but you can pass in, there's lots of different arguments you can pass, but one of the most useful is where you want the legend. And you can specify that by saying lock equals, and then I've just put upper left. And again, there's lots of different locations, and I'll show you the links to the cheat sheets which show you the different combinations you can use. So that puts a legend in the upper left. So again, all that code, and it creates this simple graph here with two different lines plotting two different pieces of data and a legend to show which is which.